All right, so I've just been kind of thinking about, or at least the one lecture that's really gotten me thinking is the ethnocentric monoculturalism lecture, especially just after doing the identity paper and thinking about my experience about growing up in the South and in Alabama. Um, my parents did they really tried to um, be intentional with letting certain terms that were used towards people of color die in their family. And they were really intentional about not letting those terms continue in their family legacy. But and I mentioned this in the identity paper. They didn't really talk about race. And if they did, and I'll get to this. So like my parents both work for the United Methodist Church, and a big initiative with just churches in general is diversity. And because especially in the South, the majority of churches are very segregated, and it's just kind of, I don't want to say it's kind of the way things are, but it's the state of the church right now, and that it's very racially segregated. So you'll typically have maybe a predominantly white church and a predominantly black church, and there's not really an in between. And if there are people of color in a congregation, they're definitely the minority. And so whenever my parents would meet or whenever a person of color would come to their church, they would just get really, really excited, um, and it was nice to see that. It was nice to see that my parents were excited about that, but there was a level of like a perception of the other and them being excited. It felt like the person was just a number, the family was just a number, that couple was just another number. And it doesn't mean that they didn't engage with those people, but because they got so excited, like they didn't get excited about, just another couple in general, whether or not they were a couple of color. Like if they didn't get excited about that, but they would get excited about somebody from a different background coming to their church, which is kind of awkward and disconcerting. But because of their reactions, it just made it seem like it was kind of, I don't know, they were treating those individuals differently, like they were like some shiny new toy or like some other person. And so I think that like that in and of itself was kind of a way that you know that my family kind of reinforced kind of that ethnocentric monoculturalism, and that, oh, they're not white, let's get excited about that. And I don't know. So it makes me think about the fact that I grew up in a fairly racially homogenous area, or at least my high school was, the cliques and the social groups in my high school were fairly like racially segregated. I didn't really interact with many people of color. My church didn't have a lot of people of color in it, and no people of color that were my age. And so it gets me wondering about like, what is that invisible veil in my experience and in my thinking that makes me, what aspect of my experience do I think is like universal to everyone else? And for me, that's terrifying, the thought of that, because I've, especially since, going to graduate school to, become a school psychologist, and just in general with my love of psychology and working with people, like I've always tried to be a person that is intrapersonally aware as well as interpersonally aware of like how I come off to other people, and being aware of my own emotions and my own biases and my own thoughts. And it's just weird to think that there is something that is elusive in my consciousness that separates, or like puts a wall between me and another person because I think my experience is universal to an extent. But just kind of thinking about how, I think about the fact that my parents were very intentional about not using certain terms in reference to people of color, and being really, really intentional about not using that kind of language. I think about maybe like not the strategies, but like the approaches and the intentionality that I want to have with the children that I interact with, professionally and not a professional level, but also when I have a family of my own, like what in my family legacy do I want to like kind of die off and instead bring to the table. And I've thought, I think for me, it's my parents didn't, and I mentioned this in the identity paper, my parents didn't really explicitly talk about race. And I think it's because I think in some ways their generation had kind of this implicit, or has this kind of implicit perspective of, in being accepting of people of different backgrounds, that you are colorblind, that you're not aware of the differences, or you don't show an awareness of the differences, because if you show an awareness of the differences, you're treating people from an unequal standpoint, and then that is detrimental rather than not affirming or being aware of the differences and the the contextual nature of people's experiences, that is actually invalidating and makes the other, or people that aren't a part of the predominant culture, white culture, in the case of my background, that makes those people feel invisible and invalidated and not a part of the fabric of their communities. And so I think, I want to have intentional conversations about race, and through this course and through other experiences, I want to learn how to celebrate differences in a way that is genuine. And I want my family to be in a context where they are exposed to different experiences from their own, and that they aren't growing up in a homogenous culture. And sometimes that, depending on where you end up in the world, that is not always easy, or I hate to say it, feasible. But if I'm not able to live in a context where there are people from, that it's an experience where my family will, have enriching interactions with people that are different from them. If I don't have that opportunity when I have a family of my own, I'd want to have intentional conversations about race, and I want to be intentional about making sure that kind of like colorblind, don't talk about it mentality isn't perpetuated. So, all right, thanks.